Okay. So this week we are going over cellular respiration. So um, this is going to be how cells use a fuel source like glucose and turn it into an energy, um, which cellular energy is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So we'll just put down that definition. Okay, so this definition that I've put up is applicable to all the types of respiration that we will talk about today. There are two main categories of respiration. We have aerobic respiration, which are that's the type of respiration that requires oxygen. Then there's anaerobic respiration, which is the type that does not require oxygen. So aerobic, air needs oxygen. Anaerobic, that an prefix means not or no. So that means no oxygen. Okay. Um, so why don't you guys tell me any terms or vocabulary words that you can think of that relate to cellular respiration? Anything you've learned in lecture, anything you remember from high school bio, anything like that. So go ahead and throw some of those terms out in the chat, and we will kind of go over each of those as we move along through the lesson. Yep. I think if you've ever been on the internet, you know that mitochondria has something to do with cellular respiration. It's the powerhouse of the cell. That's the only thing anybody ever remembers from high school. I think if there's one sentence that sums up all of high school biology, it's mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. There's a lot more that goes on, but that's the only thing anyone ever remembers. Yep. So those two terms that you mentioned, glucose and ATP, those are actually going to be a reactant and a product in our chemical reactions. And we will go through each of the chemical equations for the types of respiration that we're discussing today. So we will see exactly where those fit into the equations, whether they're on reactant side or product side. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and do we'll do aerobic respiration first, and we'll talk about its chemical equation first. So aerobic respiration. So this is the type of respiration that requires oxygen, and it is a multi-step process that happens within mammalian cells, within the mitochondria. So this one occurs within the mitochondria. And it occurs in higher organisms. Pretty much any organism that has lungs that breathes in some way is going to be undergoing aerobic respiration, because the whole purpose of breathing, inhaling, and exhaling is to bring in oxygen so that you can undergo respiration, and then exhale carbon dioxide, which is a toxic byproduct of respiration. Okay, So the chemical equation. So this chemical equation, we're going to start with, I'll write each of the chemicals first, and then I'll write the names below. So C6H12O6 plus 6O2. And these numbers, if they are to the right, are supposed to be subscripts. It's just a hassle to do subscripts while actively typing, so if I post these notes later, I will switch them to subscripts. Okay, and then 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and 38 ATP. Okay, so this first molecule that we see here, C6H12O6, anytime you see this particular arrangement, CHO and it's usually going to have a like 1-to-1 ratio of numbers, that's going to be a sugar molecule. Anytime you see CHO in this particular arrangement, it's going to be sugar. In this case, this is a glucose molecule. So glucose plus oxygen that's on our reactant side. So we are inhaling oxygen and we are using glucose from the food that we eat. And then on our product side, we have carbon dioxide, which is what we are exhaling for the most part. We have water. When you breathe when you like get really close to a mirror or a window, you see it start to fog up, right? So when you are exhaling, you're releasing the water molecules that are produced during cellular respiration. So just like we're releasing carbon dioxide that is a product of cellular respiration, we're releasing water, which is a product of cellular respiration. That's also why when you wear your mask and you have glasses, it fogs up the corners of your glasses, which is frustrating, but it's a biological process, so I guess we just have to deal with it. And then this 38 ATP here is going to be adenosine triphosphate. And I'm going to I think, move this to the left so it all fits on one line. Come on. There we go. Yeah, so that's our whole equation. Our reactant side, glucose and oxygen. Our product side, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. ATP and cellular energy are interchangeable. Anytime you're talking in biology about cellular energy, you're typically talking about ATP. There are a couple other types of energy molecules that you'll learn about, particularly if you guys go in more depth on the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. In the lecture, you'll probably learn about like NADPH or FADH, these other molecules. But for our purposes for the lab, we're just learning about ATP. Okay, does anybody notice anything in particular about this equation? What does it remind you of? So the response in chat is it reminds you of how plants synthesize energy in photosynthesis. And that is exactly what I was hoping you would say. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis are pretty much the inverse of each other. So the reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water, I love that meme. That's one of my favorite memes ever. And the products of photosynthesis are going to be glucose and oxygen, right? So then in our cellular respiration, our reactants are glucose and oxygen, and our products are carbon dioxide and water and ATP. So in plants, these two cellular processes go hand in hand. Oftentimes they're happening simultaneously, and oftentimes they are immediately feeding into each other. Um, so it's really cool that plants are completely maintaining themselves through these two complementary processes. In humans, we really only undergo cellular respiration. We're not green. We can't photosynthesize. Um, so we have to get our energy sources from somewhere else. And usually, the original biological source of that energy is going to be a plant. Somewhere along the food chain, the energy is going to come from a plant um, or a photosynthetic organism. So, we get our glucose from sources that we eat. Plants get their glucose from photosynthesis. Um, and we end up using these cellular processes complementarily. So, it's pretty cool. And you will definitely have a question on your final comparing photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Because knowing the difference between these two processes and making sure that you have the correct chemical equation for each one is incredibly important in biology. Okay, so any questions about aerobic respiration so far? I'm gonna give you guys the like 3 steps of aerobic respiration before we move on. We're not gonna go in depth on these steps, but I do want you guys to just kind of be familiar with what the steps are. I think it might help you um, as you're working through the labs. Okay, so that's not what I want. There we go. Okay, so the 3 steps of aerobic respiration are going to be, first off, glycolysis. Glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to be the splitting of the glucose molecule. So that glyco prefix, you might remember it from glycogen. So glyco relates to glucose. And then we have the citric acid cycle. You might have heard this called the Krebs cycle before, but newer textbooks are shifting the terminology so that we use citric acid cycle because it is more accurate to what's going on in the chemistry of the cycle. So that's what we're going to call it. So in the citric acid cycle, we are just sort of churning out energy molecules from the products of glycolysis. And then our last step is going to be the electron transfer chain. And you may have heard this called the electron transport chain, but again, newer textbooks are shifting towards transfer chain because transfer is a little bit more accurate to how the electrons move through all of the proteins and how they shift their energy. So it's still abbreviated ETC, conveniently, but it's now called the electron transfer chain instead of the transport chain. And this electron transfer chain is the big payoff moment of aerobic respiration. It's the reason that higher organisms shifted to aerobic respiration as opposed to anaerobic respiration. And that's because this is going to churn out like I think it's 28 to 30 of the 32 to 38 total ATP that are produced. So it's producing the vast majority of the ATP of these 3 steps. Okay? All right. So those are the 3 steps. We don't need to go in detail. Does that make sense? Does everybody get that? Great. Okay. So let's move on to our anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration can occur in the cytosol of the cell. And because this oftentimes is happening in single-celled organisms, it kind of has to happen in the cytosol of the cell. Because remember, our single-celled organisms, like bacteria, don't have organelles. Okay. And there are 2 types. There are 2 types of anaerobic respiration that we are going to talk about today. The first one is going to be lactic acid fermentation. And the second one is going to be alcohol fermentation. Okay, so are any of you familiar with these terms already? I feel like you guys have probably heard of these, even if you don't think you have. But we'll get into it, and then you can figure out whether or not you know what it is already. So lactic acid fermentation. The chemical equation for this is going to be C6H12O6 plus, actually there is no plus on this side. So that's our reactant. Our reactant is just glucose, and then it's going to produce 2 ATP, and it's going to produce 2 C3H6O3, which is lactic acid. And you don't need to remember the molecule of lactic acid, so just remember that it produces lactic acid. Okay? So that's glucose on the reactant side, and then adenosine triphosphate plus lactic acid. Okay? All right. So what do you notice about this? What is kind of different between this reaction and the reaction that we see in aerobic respiration? Exactly. Those are 2 great points. The first is it does not include oxygen on its reactant side. And the second is that it does not produce nearly as much ATP. Does not produce nearly as much ATP. And then one other thing to note is that it also doesn't include water. And that's not like a huge distinction. That's not one of like the key ones that you need to remember, but it is very interesting. And that's because water is part of the electron transport chain. And we don't use that when we're using anaerobic respiration. So we don't need water, or we don't make water. Okay, so a couple other notes about lactic acid fermentation. So this is going to be the type of anaerobic respiration that starts to happen in human muscles when there is not enough oxygen being brought in through the lungs and the respiratory system. So if one of the reasons that people get sore from working out is because they shift from solely aerobic respiration with it, where they are only producing carbon dioxide as a toxic byproduct, which gets expelled really easily. They're shifting from aerobic to anaerobic, which is lactic acid fermentation, and it produces lactic acid, which is a toxic byproduct. And lactic acid builds up in the muscular cells, and it takes a while for that lactic acid to be processed and broken down in the cells and disposed of. So that lactic acid buildup is contributing to muscle soreness. And there's a lot of research as to exactly how the lactic acid plays into muscle soreness. It's not totally worked out yet, but it is thought to be a contributing factor. There's also a lot of research into whether or not stretching helps alleviate lactic acid buildup, because that's not a surefire thing either in research. Okay, so our next type of anaerobic respiration is alcohol fermentation. And so you may be familiar with alcohol fermentation because this is a process that's commonly used in food production. So it is used in baking bread. So when you add yeast to bread, you're depending on the yeast to respire anaerobically, producing they will produce carbon dioxide and alcohol as their byproducts, which causes the bread to rise. And then again in alcoholic beverages that are fermented, this is the same process. So we have yeast, and they can be added in, as in like a beer or some sort of yeasted alcoholic beverage, or they can be wild yeast that come into the mixture naturally, which would be the case in wines. And those yeast consume the glucose that is in the grape juice or the whatever the mixture is that they use for beer. And then they turn that into carbon dioxide and alcohol, which creates the alcohol in the beverage. So it's a very commonly used process. We take advantage of yeast respiration really frequently. Okay, so let's go over the chemical reaction for this. So this one, we have, once again, we have our good old reactant glucose. And this time the glucose is going to get broken down into a few different things. So first we're going to see some carbon dioxide. And we're going to see our 2 ATP again. And then our last thing is going to be, let me do the chemical equation first. H5OH. Okay, so it produces carbon dioxide, ATP, and ethanol. So ethanol is a type of alcohol. There are a lot of other types of alcohol. This is the one that is produced in this particular type of fermentation. And it's also sometimes called ethyl alcohol. So you may see it worded ethyl alcohol, you may see it worded ethanol. It's the same thing. And also, I don't know how many of you guys are in chemistry, but a lot of times when you see an OH molecule on the end of a molecule like this, an OH means that it is an alcohol, most of the time. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it's pretty reliable, I would say. Okay, so what do you notice that, what similarities do you notice between our two types of anaerobic respiration? Similarities between our two types of anaerobic respiration. Mm-hmm. So, someone responded with the reactant is glucose. So, yes, in both of our anaerobic respiration equations, the reactant is glucose. We are still getting our energy from breaking down a glucose molecule. The same thing happens up here in our aerobic respiration. We're getting the energy from breaking down glucose molecules. Yes, that's right. Both of these anaerobic respiration processes produce 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So, when they break down a glucose molecule, typically they break it in half first and then they get 2 ATP from that process. So that happens in both types. Um, when we come back up here, you'll notice we get 38 ATP for one glucose molecule. So the difference in how much ATP you get for a single glucose molecule is substantial. So when we do aerobic, we are getting 38 ATP for one molecule. In lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation, we are getting 2 ATP for one glucose molecule. So a lot of times that's just enough glucose or just enough ATP to keep the process going. All right. So the last thing about these two types of anaerobic respiration, lactic acid and ethanol, are both toxic byproducts. So lactic acid we know builds up in the muscles when they are respiring anaerobically. Ethanol is going to build up anytime yeast is respiring anaerobically, and ethanol is actually toxic to yeast. So the yeast will actually die if enough ethanol builds up. So those are our two toxic byproducts. That is pretty much it. As for the labs that you guys are doing this week, there are only 2 modules to do, and then a post lab and a quiz. The 2 modules, one is going to take place, one is going to be aerobic respiration, one is going to be anaerobic respiration. So make sure that you are clear on which lab has aerobic respiration and which lab has anaerobic respiration. You should be able to tell based on which organism it is. And then when you are measuring, yes, that's exactly right. So the comment in the chat said microorganisms use this method because they don't need a whole lot of ATP. And that is right. So microorganisms don't use as much energy as higher organisms, so they can survive usually by respiring anaerobically. Higher organisms have a lot more cells. There's a lot more respiration going on. There's a lot of tissues that need oxygen, and a lot of extracellular processes to happen. So more ATP needs to be generated. And higher organisms would not be able to dispose of all of the waste products of anaerobic respiration properly in a timely manner. So, can you imagine if humans had to respire constantly by doing lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation? It would just be toxic immediately. So, yeah, they don't scale up is the big point there. The anaerobic respiration processes don't scale up to larger organisms. There are just a couple of calculations, I think, this week, and they should be pretty straightforward. The equation should be in the lab notebook. I think it's just going to be final minus initial. So you're measuring the change of something. And then I think you have to read a graduated gas volume measurement. So what that's going to look like, there's going to be a tapered tube that looks like this. And there's going to be a red ball of liquid in that tube. And the graduation tick marks will be on the top. Okay, so when you look at this, you're going to want to measure on the outside edge of that red sphere. So right here, you don't want to measure on the right side closer to the flask. You don't want to measure in the middle. You want to measure on the outer edge. Um, and then the other one, you're going to be measuring just the how many centimeters the gas takes up in a tube. So you'll just be using a ruler for that. So that should be okay. That measurement should be pretty easy. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, let me know. Um, Everything should be posted for this week, and I'll be posting the little instruction list that has the kind of the checklist for you um, in just a few minutes once we get off the call. So yeah, we're good to go. See you guys next week.